Hi everyone, welcome to this interview by Core Recruitment. Thank you very much for joining us today. If you're not aware, Core Recruitment is an international recruitment company and we do mid to senior level recruitment for exec and non-exec appointments. Now, we're doing this interview series basically to inject some positivity into the sector because we want to get speak to some business leaders about how they're innovating, how they're growing their businesses, and share some success stories about the sector. Now, all of these articles and interviews that we're recording can all be viewed on our website, www.corerecruitment.com. And if you've got any kind of like business leaders or you might be interested yourself in taking part, if you've got a good story to share, then please do get in touch with me, Christian Doyle at corerecruitment.com. Now, this is kind of 20, 25 minutes of your day to kind of like, get a little bit inspired. And we're really lucky to be joined today by Richard, who is the Chief Executive of XP. So how are you today, Richard?
Really good, Christian. How are you doing?
I'm very, very good indeed. Now, we've known each other for a long time, so I'm going to try
Good.
and make sure that we don't fall down any wormholes of kind of like, talking about things kind of too deliberately. So let's start nice and general. And if you can give us an overview of XP and what you guys operate and where you do it, that would be great to get us kicked off.
Yeah, of course. So XP Factory is, if you like, our umbrella company that under which we have two competitive socializing stroke experience brands. So we started off by building the Escape Hunt brand. Escape Hunt is now the global leader in escape the room operations. We've got a lovely owned and operated business in the UK, around 30 sites here, which we manage and which we've created since about 2018 when we kind of kicked off the first one. And we have around the same number of sites internationally under franchise. So really, really wonderful business, Escape Hunt. And for anybody that isn't familiar with escape rooms per se, essentially you come together, you bring your teams, that might be friends, it might be work colleagues, it might be family. We immerse you in a heavily themed, almost cinematic environment, lots of different kind of themes, etc. And you work together as a team, you find clues, you solve puzzles, etc. And essentially you escape the room, so to speak. So that's Escape Hunt. And then a more recent business for us, one actually born of COVID back in the end of 2021, is Boom Battle Bar. And Boom Battle Bar is very much in the mix in that competitive socializing space. Perhaps unlike some others in the sector, it is a multi-activity environment. So obviously bar-led, big, noisy, vibey atmospheres, but we have darts and shuffleboards, we have axe throwing, we have golf, all the sort of collection of fun stuff to do that you might imagine. So we haven't sort of singled in on golf or singled in on darts, etc. We have lots of things coming together to make that really kind of fun experience. And again, we've got about 30 of those units now in the UK, all pretty much all owned.
Excellent. Thank you very much for joining us today. So just to kind of like start in a negative leading into a positive, but like social entertainment kind of, I think in the past kind of like 18 months, there's maybe been a little bit of consolidation. People have been talking about some saturation in the market. There are concepts such as Clays, which seems to be doing very well. There are others who maybe aren't kind of like doing so well. What do you think the trend is and what steps are you taking to make sure that you guys stay relevant, especially within Boom Battle?
Yeah, it definitely over the last 18 months, there has been a bunch of challenges. I think some challenges that are specific to our sector and some challenges which are more born of the environment generally and the economy generally. I think possibly it plays to start with the latter of those. And obviously anybody operating on the high street, anybody in a consumer-led business, anybody in a hospitality business has been pretty adversely affected by rate changes, national insurance changes, national living wage increases, supply chain costs going up quite exponentially. And all of these things, these very, very significant direct costs, have impacted most businesses in our sector pretty aggressively. But of course, that direct piece is in many respects the bit that you can manage insofar as at least you understand what it's going to look like. You know that when you look at your P&L, the impact of national insurance is going to look like this. You know that the impact of a minimum wage increase is going to look like that. You know that the impact of your supplier base increasing by whatever it is going to look like this. I think the bit that's been harder to manage is the indirect impact. And that is that obviously every other business that is suffering from these same sort of structural dynamics then in and of itself has less money to spend in venues like ours in that sector and so on. And so that bit is far, far harder to understand. And so what you've seen therefore is a sector which over the last 18 months has had a structural decline in like for likes. And that sort of structural decline as a sector has been circa 8-9%, something in that sort of ballpark, which is a really, really difficult thing to go up against. But when you then compound that with the fact that as a sector, we had a really good run from 21 through 24, and new entrants have flooded the market. The barriers to entry have been quite low. A lot of operators have been able to get up and running without a massive amount of capital behind them, and so that's caused, about 10% additional sort of venues, etc., coming online each year over the last sort of 3 or 4. So if you combine those two things together, you've got a structural decline in like-for-likes around 8% born of economy and so on, and then you've got new entrants at circa 10. For an operator sort of to stand still, you're almost fighting against a sort of a negative 18. And so performance is better than that, might still feel horrible, but are actually arguably doing a little bit better than the market. So it has been definitely an interesting time. And I think, unfortunately, you are now starting to see some casualties of that. So some businesses that possibly weren't lucky enough to be as well invested, some businesses which perhaps had taken the slightly more marginal sites, which were accessible initially, cheaper to build, but ultimately are the types of sites which get hurt more quickly, when the going gets a little bit harder. And you're starting to see that consolidation. And that this isn't new news. We've seen this in a lot of sectors before. Like if you take casual dining from, the sort of the, 2010, when it was absolutely its peak and private equity money was flooding into the sector, everybody's growing at a crazy pace. And then all of a sudden, structural dynamics get tough. You start to see, again, a bit of an overcapacity. Then it becomes a lot harder. And then at the end of the day, you now see a smaller collection of very, very good operators that have weathered the storm, benefit from the consolidation dynamics, and go on to be superstar performers. And I think that is going to be the thing that we're likely to see in competitive socializing now.
Absolutely. And in terms of, because Boom Battle, I kind of always feel, because it's so multifaceted and so changeable and all that kind of stuff, I kind of feel like it's insulated from kind of like a lot of the trends that happen within that competitive kind of like socializing space. Currently, and maybe for the last kind of 3 months, I mean, the golden goose question is, what activities within Boom Battle have you seen which have been more popular? And I guess also kind of like, what are you thinking about putting in for the next 6 months to stay ahead of the curve?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. We're as a company, we're big into the analytics and we're big into the data. And so we're very, very quick to be able to understand where we're likely to get that incremental revenue, essentially per additional incidents of whatever games lane it might be. And the fact that our businesses have been deliberately designed in that modular way means it's actually historically been really easy for us to adapt to that. So, for example, when we can see quite demonstrably that having a fifth incidence of darts will generate more on a rate per square foot than a third incidence of axe throwing, let's say, it's very easy for us to swap one out into another and sort of try and optimize for revenue. I mean, it's that said, we've been quite lucky as a business, and actually games typically are at capacity of at all the sort of the peak times that you would imagine. So it's not really that games do not sell out when it is busy. So instead, you have to kind of look at it, the order in which they sell out, i.e. if everything was available to you, what does sell first, despite the fact that on average, our consumers might have wanted to do axe throwing, but in the absence of that, are very happy to transition into darts. And in the absence of that, are very happy to transition into shuffleboards. But in terms of order, axe throwing remains a very, very popular thing. That remains the thing that is invariably completely booked out in all sites, in all spaces, in any kind of peak time. Darts and shuffleboarding definitely follow sort of a close sort of second and third. And then beyond that, there's kind of a bit of a muchness with all the other kind of activities. So it's been a really fun business to watch. And as I say, what we've been really encouraged by is a customer's propensity to move into an activity that is free, rather than to obsess about the one activity that they might have preferred to do. So that's been a really, really powerful thing, I think, for us as a business.
And what have you seen in terms of like those kind of slightly more tech enabled, like the VR concepts, all of that kind of stuff as well? Because having tried them kind of like not in Battle Bar, but within kind of like other operators, there are other operators out there, it's like, they felt a little bit clunky. They felt a little bit kind of like, if the tech isn't working absolutely perfectly, it's not a brilliant experience. What are your thoughts on those?
I've got I've got quite a strong view on tech actually in the sector, and I think that for me, the guiding principle should be that tech is only there to the extent that it truly enhances the customer experience. It is not there for the sake of being tech enabled. And I do think there are certain elements where having tech enabled, whatever it might be, is there because it's sort of different and it's interesting, but it doesn't necessarily add anything to the gameplay, which has forever and a day been fabulous in an analog fashion. I think for me, an example of where I think tech has worked phenomenally well in the sector is darts. And the reason why for me that works so incredibly well is that it's such an obvious customer enhancement because so few people play darts regularly enough. Even if you're playing 501, how many people truly have the mental agility to kind of count back and understand, that's just not a thing that people have in their lockers. So you are truly enhancing the customer experience in that regard. So I think tech in darts, as a really good example, has really moved forwards what was forever and a day been a fantastic popular analog game that people have played in pubs forever and a day, but this has really moved it forwards. I think there are examples perhaps where that hasn't worked as well. And if I look at our own business, less so in Boom, but if I take Escape Hunt, our escape rooms business, we tried in a small-ish number of rooms across that estate to introduce VR rooms, and that in some respects seemed like quite a sensible thing to do. Clearly, there was a market for it. Clearly, a few people were kind of garnering a little bit of traction, but we've actually completely stepped back from it now because what you've seen is it's a lot harder to control a fully tech-enabled experience, the extent to which something is a little bit buggy. You cut in an escape room, it's obviously everybody has a business where things can go wrong. But if things go wrong in our escape rooms, our games hosts are able to navigate that journey. Customers don't really get affected by it. So their output is fantastic from a customer perspective. If something goes wrong in a VR room, there's very little you can do. So that's not a great place to play. And moreover, for us, we've kind of realized that it slightly flies in the face actually of what we were trying to do strategically anyway. The whole point of building this escape rooms business was to bring people together in a specifically non-digital environment to kind of, immerse yourself in something very much more real. And of course, in a VR experience, it's much more insular. You'll put your headsets on. It's now, you might have 4 other people in the room, but there's not really any specific interaction. So we've actually stepped back from that. And when we've put the games with like kind of more traditional games back in by replacement, we've seen quite significant increases in rates per room, etc. So I'm not at all suggesting that there isn't a really important place for tech, but I do think it is important that tech is truly there to enhance the customer experience and not there for the sake of being such.
Absolutely, and it's executed properly as well. So I guess I'm sorry. So it was probably a couple of years ago because my kids are a little bit older now. But I don't know if you remember this, but you gave us a really nice experience because you were trialing out basically Alice in Wonderland at Boom Battle Bars. And basically, it was like a treasure hunt with iPads. You would go around West London trying to find this thing and that thing. And the next thing, my kids still speak about it today. It was absolutely phenomenal. And this was all part of the kind of trying to use the tech and the brand to create an experience outside of the unit and do it kind of like in interesting places and do it at home. And there's a phrase which I really hate, which is trying to get super sticky with kind of like, customer and all of that kind of side of things as well. Ick. But it's like, but that whole side of things, as far as we can see, kind of like has kind of died off a little bit. Is it still working for you in some facets, or are you still trying that in some places?
No, we do. We still do quite a lot of it. It was an escape hunt initiative rather than Boom. No, we absolutely do still do a lot of out of room experiences. That whole play was a response to COVID, as you can imagine. So, of course, all of our physical sites got locked down. How do we therefore still continue to engage the team that we've built? How do we continue to engage with customers, etc.? So trying to do things that, be it play at home games, be it out of home experiences, etc., became a bit of an important thing. But you're right, that transition then shifted to actually having a more accessible entry point into the brand. With the best one in the world, experiences in our kind of sector are quite expensive for the average family. These are not cheap things to do. Now, obviously, they've got very high production costs and they've got very high, sort of running, etc. So it's not like anyone's sort of making out like bandits particularly, but nonetheless, there is a cost to pay for that quality of experience, and it's not cheap. And so in a market where there is a little bit of pressure on family spending, and there is a little bit of pressure on headline pricing. Having a new customer be able to access your brand at a much lower price point, but then hopefully engage with it just as well and really find something that's exciting, it probably gives you a little bit more confidence to step up that purchasing ladder, actually, when you have to make a slightly bigger purchase into the physical rooms. And so we still find that it's got a really, really powerful place there. And moreover, we're proud of those experiences. They're good experiences, they're fun experiences, they are a little bit different. People like doing stuff that brings you in and around cities, using almost the game experience as an opportunity to explore a city, see parts of it that you might not otherwise be able to see. So we still think it's a really important thing to do.
Excellent. That's really good. Now, the other area where you guys are particularly strong, which seems to be on everyone's agenda at the moment, is franchising, and especially kind of like international franchising. Specifically with I mean, on both businesses, but specifically with Escape Hunt, where you've been so successful with that. Can you tell us a bit about the journey, how you've partnered internationally, where you are?
Yeah. So the franchising part is not straightforward, to be honest. And don't get me wrong, it's not like we haven't made a lot of missteps, etc. But I think the first thing has to kind of come back to concept and exactly what it is that you are trying to, if you like, what sort of what the DNA is that you're trying to replicate, and whether or not it is even possible to replicate it culturally when you franchise. And I think on the Escape Hunt side, what's been really interesting is that because we can produce our games centrally you can immediately normalize for quality differentials. And you can immediately sort of start to get much better continuity on the physical delivery of the game zooms and the props, etc. Because we can offer a lot of things to a franchisee that would be very, very difficult, particularly in that environment, for them to do, or very expensive for them to do in a small number of sites. So we've put millions of pounds into development into the platform that we use to run these units, and that makes them very, very, very much more effective and easy to run, in inverted commas, than perhaps some of our competitors set. But that's a really expensive investment that we've created to build this proprietary system and platform. So you're not going to be able to do that as an individual looking to sort of open and run a business. So the fact that you can tap into us and you can have access to these platforms, you can have access to 8 years worth of marketing experience and data and analytics, etc. That is a very powerful thing for franchisees. But I think the other thing you have to recognize is you need a model that structurally can throw off money enough that actually franchisees can afford to pay a royalty and can afford to kind of come into that as well. And of course, the challenge in a lot of these sectors, if you look at a lot of people's owned and operated businesses, if you're running at that sort of 5 or 6% EBITDA number, as a lot of owned businesses are in our sector, if they're doing well, there's no, how can you afford you can't afford to pay anything out of that dynamic, irrespective of what platforms it is that you're kind of getting for that. So we're very lucky, and Escape Hunt works really well because it's a high margin business. There is a lot of proprietary software, tech, and physical room delivery that we can offer that you just wouldn't be able to do yourself. And it's relatively straightforward to run. And I mean that because our sites don't require 60 to 80 people. We run an operation, even when it's at its fullest, on about 6 people in a site. And that's a much easier thing for a franchisee to get their head around. Well, as soon as you start running big bars, big, massive competitive socializing things, and you're running staff of 100 people a site by the time you're rotating around, that's now a big operational business. So you need a really high caliber operator that's done a lot of multi-site stuff before. And those guys are quite hard to come by. To find the person that can truly take it out and do 20, 30, 40, 50 sites, there aren't many examples in our sector where that has been done well. There are a lot of examples of people taking a franchise and running that in isolation, but that's quite suboptimal in my view on a bigger scale. So I do think you've got to be very specific about the type of businesses it has. I think a lot of businesses fundamentally don't work for franchise. And I don't think it's the golden goose that people often think it is. I've got this thing, let's just sell it over here to a person prepared to pay, because it will always come back and bite you. I think you have to have the right structural dynamics. I think the business has to be the right sort of business to be franchisable. I think you have to have something demonstrable to offer to a franchisee that they simply would not be able to do themselves without expending significant sums of money. And I think you have to have a lot of data that says, if you do all of these things, as we have here, this is what the distribution of returns looks like. This is therefore a likely proxy for what you might be able to go on and achieve, which is very different to, I've got one concept that is up here and we all think it's kind of cool, so let's now go and sell it to anybody that will buy it. And so, which has been a bit of a function of our sector generally. So I don't think it's straightforward.
So Richard, I think I could do a whole webinar with you just talking about IP, because like you've done so much great work in that space. There's a story that stuck in my head from kind of like yonks ago, in terms of some of the work that you did with Doctor Who. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think it's a really good one.
Yeah, it was a really kind of pivotal moment actually for us as a business. So obviously this was in the escape hunt, pretty early on in our escape hunt journey. And if we'd step back to sort of our lofty ambitions when we set the business up, obviously you set yourself a collection of targets. You kind of think of sort of way out here and, could you ever dream big enough to achieve X, Y, and Z? And those targets, generally speaking, will involve some kind of financial performance. If everything aligned, could you possibly create box economics that look like X, Y, or Z? Could you possibly, be, in our case at the time, the mainstream provider for what was at the time an incredibly niche escape rooms industry, which was out of town, underinvested, etc.? Could you be the prime front and center provider in shopping centers, the most kind of A1 locations around the country, and could you do it at scale? And then the really, really big one was, could you ever persuade TV studios, film studios, IP owners to let you license their content and bring that to life for them, knowing that they at the time required experiential outlets in order to engage with their customers? But that felt ridiculous at the time because, we had nothing. And no one really, even at the time, the unprompted awareness of escape rooms was less than 5%. I mean, we're going back 8-9 years now. That's obviously very different today, but no one knew what it was. And when you could think about that landscape where we were, despite having had quite credible careers prior to doing what we do now, myself and my COO, who were between us, probably signed, been involved with the signing of 400 or 500 sites in the UK. We were going to landlords that we had known for years and saying, well, we've got this escape rooms concept. We'd love to have a site. Oh, sorry, what's an escape room? Well, essentially, we lock people up in a room. Sorry, you lock people in a room, not a chance, not in our location. So that was the backdrop. No one knew what it was. You couldn't get sites. It was really bloody difficult. But then nonetheless, we slightly naively perhaps thought, well, let's have a crack and let's see if we can't actually bring a little bit of IP to life. So we got in contact with the BBC, and the BBC's largest IP was Doctor Who. And the thing that's really exciting about that sort of IP is it's really rich in kind of identity that is immediately recognizable. So there's no point having an IP that, if you think about other stuff that the BBC had at the time, which was doing really well, Luther was doing unbelievably well on TV for the BBC. But there's no point licensing something like that. Best one in the world, absent Idris Elba, you've just got a room that could be any room. Whereas, of course, there's so much iconic sort of imagery associated with Doctor Who,
100%.
villains, and so it was amazing. So somehow we were lucky enough to persuade them to allow us to license this, and then our games design team worked in conjunction with the BBC's creatives over a period of time to really bring these rooms and bring these experiences to life. And they've been fab. But it was amazing for the team to work with creatives and brand owners on the BBC side. It was awesome for customers to have this experiential outlet. We had some, really, really, really great engagement. And the thing was, from a credibility perspective, we were a brand new business. We had no trading here in the UK. It was a credibility point. So it allowed us, it almost kind of gave us access to have a slightly more grown-up conversation and further. And then we went on from there to do a little bit of stuff with Netflix, with a few others, etc. And I think it was really that door having been opened that set the stage and allowed us to build from there. And it's exciting. And we're forever sort of talking about the IP that we generate internally, and we're incredibly proud of that internally generated IP too. But being able to have been part of that Doctor Who story, I think, was a really proud moment for us.
That's incredible. I'm all in for Stranger Things, Richard. So if you like, when that one comes up, you let me know 100%. Now you studied economics at university and got into hospitality. I think it was actually Allegra McEvedy from Leon who introduced us when you were working at Pret as
You know
strategy
what?
director.
You know what? I
Along
think it was. God, that goes back some time, doesn't it?
it
Yeah.
goes back a long time. But like, from studying economics at university to moving into the kind of like hospitality sphere, like, how did that journey happen and what is it about the sector that kind of like keeps you so interested and engaged?
Well, it certainly wasn't planned. I think so because whilst I studied economics, actually most of my university career was as a musician. I was off around the world playing. That's kind of what I did.
I didn't know that. What do you do?
I was a classical musician. I'm of a whole family of classical musicians. My sister's at the opera house. My parents were at Glyndebourne singers. So my whole kind of world was actually classical
Do you
music.
sing, Richard?
No, I can't sing. No, I was an oboist. I was as you can imagine, as a woodwind instrument, very cool. So much of my sort of university was actually doing that, despite getting a degree in economics. But of course, you never have a clue where you're gonna end up and what you do. And I started off. I got a fantastically lucky break early on, and I was on one of these management training schemes in a Japanese tech company, and so that was amazing, and learned an awful lot. It was one of these great schemes that kind of moved you around all sorts of areas of the business. So it was ostensibly finance backed, if you like, but you did a little bit of time in marketing, you did a little bit of time in sales, you did a little bit of time in IR, and so you just got to understand a few more dynamics that sort of sat alongside business more generally. And for somebody that obviously is coming into this completely green from a family of musicians where there's no chat of business, this was a really, really, really good learning curve. And I kind of went from there into a sort of more corporate finance role, initially in the pharmaceutical industry. And those sorts of things where you're playing quite a lot in M&A tend to lead themselves over time to strategy. Like, it's not at all an uncommon jump to move from sort of M&A stuff into strategy. The two things are intrinsically linked. And I got a ridiculous chance that I probably was chronically underqualified for, to go and be part of the strategy team at Constellation Wines, what was now Accolade here in the UK, biggest wine company in the world. And the guy that was sort of running that business really sort of took me under his wing and tried to drag me up, and took this completely nascent sort of very green almost kid and sort of dragged me through the ranks, gave me exposure to a bunch of stuff that you probably wouldn't have expected to have. And it put a massive number of years on experience. And that was the thing that allowed me to then move into Pret, to run strategy for Pret at that time. Again, a phenomenal business. I was so privileged to be there at the absolute kind of growth time for that. And it was
You were in China then as well, weren't you?
yeah, that was one of the things that we did. China, France was new territory that we did at the time, but it was awesome. And Pret was walking on water back then. It was an incredible place to be with some really inspiring people. But the thing is that you're exposed to just so many wonderful dynamics that you kind of that take a big place, and you might, even if it's sort of at the back of your mind, you're constantly being influenced by the way that, Clive at the time, who was the CEO, was just the most inspirational leader. The way he could walk in and command a room without saying anything. And it was just he was just erudite and thought through and smart, and he lived and died by the customer. And you're taking all of that stuff in, even if you don't realize you are subconsciously. And then in a Pret at the time was the most extraordinarily well operated business. It was so consistent wherever you were, anywhere in the world. But of course, that doesn't happen by accident. That is a process-led, design with some phenomenal operators that were, one of whom, Pano, is obviously now running that show. But you'd watch and you take this sort of stuff in, and even, as I say, you're doing it subconsciously, but it's starting to build this kind of game book. And I was lucky from there that I was able to start mucking around and doing a little bit of my own stuff after that for a period as well. And then you kind of get into this world where you start to think, well, maybe there's an opportunity to do more. And if you were to do that, what would you have to do? And you'd obviously have to be able to fund it. So how would you do that? So I went down this peculiar route of setting up a cash shell on AIM and then reversing businesses into that pretty uncommon route at the time. But nonetheless, it worked well. And then things just sort of build from there. So I never set out as young Rich at 20 to end up in hospitality. But when you start working through those businesses, first Constellation, then into Pret, which is just the most consumer focused business, and you just find this love for it, and you find that this idea that there's no quicker feedback than when you're in one of your own sites and you're watching customers engage with product and with team and with everything that you do. In that instant whether or not you've done a good job, a poor job, or something in the middle by just the way they react. And that's a really powerful dynamic. That's a dopamine. So there's no sort of getting something out there and waiting 5 years down the line for some feedback. That real-time dynamic, that hustle, that bustle, it's just intoxicating. And when you've worked in those environments, it's very hard to move out. I'm a big believer that when you go to work, you've got to want to get out of bed. You've got to want to get up. And there are a lot of people, unfortunately, that are stuck around desk jobs that they hate, in environments that they couldn't care less about, in an industry that they don't understand. Well, in our industry, it's real. We're customers of our own businesses. We are passionate about what we do. We want to see customers having a good time. Once you've started off in hospital, I don't think you can kind of come back. I don't know what on earth. If you force me into a new industry now, God knows what I want to go and do, because I don't think there's anything quite like it. And whilst hospitality's had its tough years more recently, I think that fundamental DNA is just a wonderful thing.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I know today is focused on XP Factory and that side of the business and all of that kind of stuff. But I mean, you have been involved with lots of different startup businesses and established businesses and all of that kind of stuff as well. And business, entrepreneurship, that kind of side of things. I mean, they are just, you're practically written like in the dictionary, kind of like under there, Richard. You know what I mean? It's like, it's incredible. But was this always a thing? I mean, were you selling lemonade to your friends when you were kind of 7 years old? Is this something which kind of like evolved over time? Was it that Clive Schley moment that kind of really kind of kind of inspired you?
Do you know, so clearly, I think I don't consider myself an entrepreneur. I consider myself just somebody that likes to dabble and likes to get involved with stuff and find stuff interesting, and then can go down a rabbit hole very quickly and deeply. And then someone who has been historically prepared to place the bet. And I think that's it. And I think that's very different, because I think there are a lot of people who, from an incredibly early age, know that they can't work for somebody else, know that they have to have their own dynamic, and they've got an idea and they want to go for it, and that's it. And that's the only thing they can do. I'm not that guy. I really enjoyed working in big businesses. I really, really enjoyed it. I thrived in it, actually. I loved it. So I happen to have been very fortunate and to have got involved with some bits and bobs that have been fun. But I think it's more born of just a natural curiosity, just a kind of wanting to understand more, trying to sort of see the angle. And I suppose it's a bit of the strategy thing, right? If the key sort of aspect for many people in strategy roles fundamentally is, how do I take a thing that is this size and make it materially larger? And that obviously spans multiple facets. But it's quite an interesting thing. But that's a very, very, very obvious thing that you want to do with kind of small startup entrepreneurial based businesses. How do I take this nub of an idea and turn it into a multifaceted thing that has absolute facility to scale, and that can surpass whatever we might have imagined the ceiling could be? So I think it's just born of a natural curiosity. I mean, God, as I say, I'm from a family of musicians, right? The idea that you'd go off and do anything in business, well, none of us understood that. All we understood was classical music. So it's just an evolution born of curiosity.
Excellent. Now, we've had kind of like a good chat for 25 minutes, and we focused very much on the positive. And I want to finish up with my two final questions, which may lead a little bit on the negative, but will hopefully be a positive. Now, not every day is a sunny day in business. Sometimes things go wrong. Can you tell us a little bit about, I don't want to use the word failure, but tell us about your biggest failure and kind of like what you learned from it?
Oh, man. I'm happy to talk about failure. I mean, I've had hundreds of them. And continue to, like, week on week we fail, and I think it's really important, because I think if you're not failing, you're not trying hard enough and you're not pushing the boundary. And I think escape hunt would be a really good example of this, actually. When I mentioned that the way we kind of came to be was that we kind of created this cash flow, and then this cash shell, and then we sort of did the escape hunt reverse and so on and so forth, and we went to grow it. But at that time, I'd imagined that we would grow it in a particular type of way. And probably naively, I had assumed that we would do it more akin to where the market was, which was these less invested, more niche sites that you could go very quickly with, that didn't require sort of big landlord, etc. And we kind of put the money together on that basis. And it was very, very soon after that we then kind of had that thinking that I've just described around actually allowing yourself to imagine that you could be materially bigger and own the sector. But that in many respects was a big fail, because it meant that it cost a hell of a lot more than I thought it was going to. It took a hell of a lot longer than I could ever have imagined that it would. It was so much harder to do than I thought it would be. It never really occurred to me naively that it would be so difficult to build rooms in this way that are heavily thematic, but can be pulled apart and ripped apart. Customers are kind of brutal when they're in these rooms, and rightly so. That's what they're there for. So, and you couldn't at the time look up in the yellow pages, escape room set builder. It wasn't an industry. It didn't exist. You have to build it from first principles. How do you get these things to run? The software. You have to build it from first principles. And I naively assumed that none of this stuff would be anything like so hard as it went on to be. And it was a big failure, because it meant we were slow. We were costing so much more money than we'd ever imagined. We couldn't get these things out at the rate we could. We couldn't do landlord deals because, as I just explained, landlords didn't want you locking people up. Everything took so much longer. Massive failure. But I think the thing that you learn from it is that ultimately it was the right thing to have failed at. Because if we look at where we are now, having fought those battles, having kind of gone through it, we have the standout business in the sector where all of a sudden the returns have just surpassed anything we could have imagined. We've got this incredible team that builds. We've got this kind of IP set up that just works and it does its thing. So now we're in a place where, my God, if we hadn't failed back then, I wouldn't want to be running the business that we would otherwise have created, because I think we'd be having a really, really tough time. Whereas actually we now have this product that is flying even in the face of a very difficult market. But it was a big failure at the time.
Well, thanks for being so candid about that. It's really interesting to see it, and I'm really glad it's a success for you now. Now, in terms of the UK economic situation, the government, kind of like, the kind of current state within kind of like hospitality, I can see a wry smile kind of like appearing on Richard's face, but kind of like, in a bit like, but what do you think the government can be doing this year to encourage hospitality businesses, encourage entrepreneurship, and get us back on a growth pathway?
Is the question what the government can be doing, or is the question what the government will do?
I think what they can do. Let's talk theoretically.
It's really difficult. I mean, I think there are a number of things, obviously, that have so dramatically damaged not just our sector, but the consumer sector per se, and actually business confidence generally. I mean, the very, very, very obvious one is national insurance. The impact that the national insurance had, not just in our sector and not just in hospitality businesses directly, but the whole of the sector and the whole of business and confidence and so has been just disastrous. Now, whether or not, even if you were to reverse that now, it would make a difference because the damage is set in, I'm not so sure. I think that that those kind of big things that have really unsettled and set business. I mean, if you look at the sort of the net outflow of funds away from UK equity, it was the highest outflow that we've seen in sort of 3 years. Ahead of the budget. That is a terrible sign for business confidence, born of government policy. So could they change it? Too late now. I think that is done. So where for our sector might they be able to play? I think for me, the bit that has been destroyed is investor sentiment in our sector. I think the narrative has been so negative that it is very, very much harder for investors to get themselves over the line in order to actually kind of back what is really the lifestyle, the beating heart of, I think, community. Like hospitality is the beating heart of your local town, your community and your village. And I think it's become very, very, very much harder for investors to get behind that right now. No, you know, there have been some positive changes to the EIS structure that did come out in November. So that is a good thing. That does kind of insulate a little bit further investors to a greater degree against making some sort of structural decisions to invest in the sector. I think business rates for many people in hospitality is a huge concern. If you have a business, if you're kind of at the smaller end or the bigger end, then you're being really adversely affected by business rates, irrespective of the narrative. It's only if you're one of the lucky few in the middle with where actually there is a material benefit. And that is something that is demonstrably within control to actually go after business rates, etc. I think that, there has been obviously a backtrack on the employee rights bill, which would have been a very, very, very difficult thing for the hospitality sector to have absorbed in a market, in a sector that is born of short hours contracts, that is born of, kind of weird ways of working, right? Our own employees don't often want to have a 40-hour contract. They don't often want even to have a 20-hour contract. They want to be able to work some hours in and around studying at university, and we're late and we're early, and it's a weird sector for hours. And sort of these bills, as you can understand where the sort of the motivation was to write them, but fortunately I think that would have had a fairly catastrophic effect on kind of hiring facility and the way that you want to encourage people into the sector. And you were starting to see it, right? You were seeing employers just stop. You saw, I think Indeed put their numbers out just before Christmas. I believe I'm right in saying there were almost 20% fewer jobs on the aggregated platforms than there had been a year prior. So that's probably telling you, in part at least, that actually nervousness around bringing people in is a challenge, and that's not good for the sector either. So that's definitely something that I think needs to be concerned, and it has been put a little bit more on the back shelf. The thing, however, fundamentally that we will benefit from, I think, in the sector is just more business confidence generally. Everything we've spoken about is going to the direct running costs and running process of hospitality businesses. But more than anything, we're affected by the indirects. We are affected by sentiment, I think, more than anything else. If you don't have businesses that are prepared to spend money with you, that are prepared to do their team, outings with you, their kind of Christmas parties there, whatever it might be, that is a challenge. Those same people that don't have the budgets at work, then innately as individuals are nervous because, if my company hasn't got a budget to do X, Y, and Z, is my job at risk? So now that flows into your family dynamic. I'm not spending money. I want to save everything I've got. I don't know that I'm going to be employed tomorrow. That sentiment piece, I think, is the most significant. And until we get some real sense that there is control of the budget, control of business sentiment, certainty as to what's going to come ahead, rather than this kind of nonsensical flip-flopping between policy and idea and so on, which just gets markets into turmoil, as evidenced by the outflow of funds away from the UK, as evidenced by kind of investment decisions and so on and so forth. You can't have that turmoil. It is impossible to operate with consistency. And it means that for the sector, we all sit back and we're not making the investment decisions that we would otherwise make. You're nervous to do so. I want to be investing in many, many, many more sites, because every time we open a site, we employ another 50 people. And obviously we're very fortunate. We are still making quite a lot of cash, and so we are still opening a lot of sites. But to be fair, we'd be opening a lot more had it been not for the policies of the last 2 years. So I think it's challenging. What will they do? I don't imagine that we'll see any change. I just think there's an intransigence. I just don't see a movement. I hope I'm wrong. What could they do? Get some clarity, get some certainty, put out a degree, just stop flip-flopping, put something out there, understand where we're going, allow businesses to get a little bit of confidence back, allow a more attractive investment environment, and possibly play with business rates. But I don't know that I buy that any of it's going to occur, but I hope I'm wrong.
Absolutely. Richard, thank you so much for hopping on. Thank you so much for having a chat. I thought that was really insightful, especially kind of like all of the IP and all of that kind of stuff as well. I thought that was absolutely brilliant, and hope you guys continue opening lots of sites, doing lots of franchise deals and lots of Stranger Things, Doctor Who type deals as well. Can't wait.
Amazing. Christian, what a pleasure. Really, really nice to see you.